A winter so brutal it feels like the world itself has stopped breathing. Snow piled like white graves across Valley Forge, men wrapped in torn blankets, their ribs showing through their uniforms. Horses collapsing from hunger, fires barely burning, soldiers whispering that they might not survive another night. And at the center of it all, one man, George Washington, standing like a wall against the darkness. But on this night, something happens that no soldier, no general, no historian could have predicted. A faint sound breaks through the howling wind. Not boots, not gunfire, not retreat. A soft trembling whine. A dog, a small dog, shivering, its paws bleeding from the ice, its face lowered as it wanders right into the American camp. The soldiers stare, confused. A living creature crossing battle lines, alone, carrying something strange around its neck. A collar, not a stray, not a wild animal. Someone's companion. Washington steps forward. His officers think he'll ignore it. They're starving, freezing, dying. It's just a dog. But Washington kneels. He brushes the snow off the collar, and then the air itself changes. The collar reads one name, General William Howe, the commander of the British Army. Washington's enemy. The soldiers murmur. A British general's dog should be a trophy. A message. A symbol of power. Some suggest it could even be used for leverage. In war, mercy is a luxury nobody can afford. But Washington doesn't see an animal belonging to an enemy. He sees something different, something sacred, something human, something beyond the battlefield. He lifts the dog gently into his arms, as if the weight of war itself has softened for a moment. Then Washington does something so unexpected, so bold, that even his harshest critics would remember it for centuries. He calls for pen and paper. His hands, numb from cold, begin to write. A letter, not of mockery, not of triumph, but of respect. A message declaring that he is returning the beloved companion of General Howe, safely. And with honor. When he finishes, he wraps the letter carefully around the dog's collar, making sure it will reach its owner intact. The officers watch in disbelief. Why return something to the enemy? Why show kindness in a war where kindness can get you killed? Why respect a man trying to destroy everything you stand for? Washington answers without speaking, because character isn't shown when you're winning. It's revealed when you're freezing, starving, and losing hope. And still choose the right thing. He orders a flag of truce. Imagine it. Soldiers stepping out of the American camp, carrying the small dog across the battlefield where thousands had fallen, approaching the British line with no weapons raised. Only a living message of humanity. The British soldiers, expecting an attack, freeze in shock as they see what's happening. Then word spreads like wildfire. The Americans are returning General Howe's dog. Washington himself sent it back. He sent a letter, a respectful one. In minutes, whispers become awe. Even Howe, the fierce British commander, is shaken. Not by guns, not by strategy, but by a gesture so honorable, it forces him to rethink the man he's fighting. That moment, cold, quiet, simple, travels through both armies like fire through dry leaves. And in a war filled with blood, betrayal, and desperation, this act becomes something rare. Story soldiers tell each other to believe that goodness still exists. Washington could have kept the dog. He could have used it. He could have ignored it. But instead, he revealed something about himself that terrified enemies more than muskets or cannons ever could. Man with an unbreakable moral spine. Leader who understood that power isn't just taken, it's earned by the choices nobody sees coming. And right there, in the frozen misery of Valley Forge, that choice changed everything, because the soldiers realized something. If Washington could show compassion even in hell, then maybe they could survive it. Maybe they could win. Maybe they were following not just a commander, but a man worthy of building a nation. The dog incident wasn't just a story. It was a turning point, a spark of humanity in a place where humanity was dying, and its impact would echo through time, shaping Washington's legend not as a general, but as the man who proved that even in war, integrity matters. But the story, it doesn't end with the dog walking back into the British camp. In fact, that moment awakened something inside the freezing ranks of Washington's men, because that night, in the quiet after the dog was returned, a strange silence settled over Valley Forge, not the silence of defeat, but the silence of realization. Imagine the camp, fires barely alive, flickering like dying stars, wind whipping through torn tents, snow crunching under the weight of hopelessness. Men lying on the frozen ground, too weak to move, wrapped in rags where uniforms used to be. But in the middle of all this suffering, something begins to shift. A young soldier, no older than 17, leans toward his comrade and whispers, "Did you hear? The general returned the enemy's dog." Why would he do that? What kind of man does that in a war like this? And the answer spreads like a secret they were never meant to hear, because he's Washington, not just their commander, not just a general, but a man who refused to lose his humanity. Even when everything else was stripped away, that night, men who hadn't smiled in months smiled at men who thought the world had no kindness left. Feel something crack open inside them. Because if Washington, surrounded by death, starving, frozen, burdened with an entire nation's hopes, can still show compassion, then maybe they could still find strength. Asterisk, asterisk. Hours after the dog is returned, something unbelievable happens. A British writer approaches the American line under a white flag. The soldiers tense up, thinking it's a trick, but the messenger carries no weapon, just a sealed note, a note. For Washington. Inside is a message from General Howe. He thanks Washington for returning his dog. He calls the act noble. He calls it unexpected. He calls it the gesture of a man who leads with honor. Imagine that. A British general praising the man he is supposed to crush. Washington reads the note silently. He does not smirk. He does not boast. He folds it gently and puts it away, as if it's just another reminder of the burden he carries to win a war without losing himself. Asterisk, asterisk, gaze. Past. The cold becomes worse. Supplies run even lower. Disease spreads. Men collapse in the snow and never rise again. But something has changed. Every night, soldiers talk about the dog story. They repeat it like a prayer, like a spark in the darkness. If the general hasn't given up, then neither will we. We'll fight. We'll hold on. We'll survive. Moral rises. For the first time in weeks, hope enters Valley Forge. Asterisk, asterisk, and then something else happens. Word of Washington's gesture travels beyond the camps. It reaches civilians. It reaches Congress. It reaches foreign allies. Watching from across the ocean, they hear of a general who is not cruel, not power hungry, not desperate for dominance, but a man of principle, a man who fights with honor, a man who chooses dignity over advantage. Suddenly, the world sees Washington differently. Not as the leader of a rebellion. But as the man who could lead a nation. This one act, returning a dog, becomes evidence of something bigger than strategy or battlefield genius. A man with character powerful enough to inspire loyalty even in starvation. A man whose humanity became more dangerous to his enemies than any weapon he carried. Asterisk, asterisk. Weeks later, when reinforcements arrive, when new supplies flow in, when troops slowly regain strength, many soldiers whisper the same thing. We survived because Washington reminded us what kind of men we wanted to be. And years later, after the war is won, after the British surrender, after Washington becomes the first president, this story resurfaces again and again. Foreign leaders mention it, scholars record it, soldiers who lived through Valley Forge tell it to their children, because it wasn't just a dog. It wasn't just a letter. It wasn't just a gesture. It was proof that even in humanity's darkest winters, leadership is defined by the choices you make when no one expects you to be good. Washington didn't win the revolution because he had the largest army or the most powerful weapons. He won because his men believed in him, and they believed because of moments like this, moments where honor survived the cold, moments where kindness lit up the night, moments where a small shivering dog walked into a camp of dying men and reminded them that greatness begins with character. This is the story history almost forgets, but soldiers never did. But the true weight of Washington's gesture didn't reveal itself immediately. Its impact unfolded slowly, like warmth spreading through frozen limbs. Because in the days after the dog incident, something subtle began to shift in Valley Forge. The camp, once filled only with groans, coughs, and the scratching sound of rats digging through empty barrels, started to feel alive again. Not because conditions improved. Not because food arrived. Not because reinforcements marched in, but because the soldiers felt something that had almost died inside them. Pride. They were proud to serve under a man unlike any leader they'd heard of. Man who refused to surrender to darkness. A man who reminded them what it meant to be human. One night, not long after, a group of soldiers gathered around a dying fire. Snowflakes landed on their faces and instantly melted from the heat of their breath. They huddled close, too weak to sit upright, but too determined to fall asleep and freeze. One of them, the oldest, a veteran of multiple campaigns, spoke in a hoarse whisper. Men, I've served under many commanders. Some cruel, some ruthless, some brilliant. But I've never seen a man do what Washington did. Another soldier asked, why does that matter? How does returning a dog help us survive? The old soldier looked up, eyes burning despite the cold, because it proves something. Washington isn't driven by hate. He isn't driven by ego. He's driven by something greater. If he can stay honorable in this hell, then he's not losing. And if he's not losing, then neither are we. Silence. Then one soldier, barely more than a boy, began to cry softly. Not from weakness, but because the words struck him deep. Sir, do you really think we can win this war? The old soldier placed a shaking hand on his shoulder. We're not following a general. We're following a man the world will remember. That moment changed something. Unspoken, frostbite still chewed at their skin. Disease still spread. Hunger still clawed at their stomachs. Like a living beast, but morale the invisible. Weapon returned. And in war, morale is stronger than muskets. A few days later, something extraordinary happened. Washington walked through the camp. No formal inspection. No trumpets. No entourage. Just a man moving between the rows of battered tents, the snow crunching under his boots. He stopped at every cluster of soldiers. He spoke quietly. He asked about their health. He thanked them for holding on. Men who thought they couldn't stand stood. Men who thought they couldn't speak answered. Men who thought Washington was a distant figure suddenly felt him close. Some cried openly when he passed. Others saluted with trembling arms. Some simply stared, unable to believe the man they followed was still walking among them, sharing the same cold, same hunger, same danger. Washington wasn't above them. He was among them. And in that moment, the soldiers felt something they had forgotten. They weren't fighting for orders, they were fighting for a future, and Washington was that future. Asterisk, asterisk, but then another twist. Another moment that would deepen the legend. A scout approached Washington with news. General, the British have learned of your act. Some of their officers are calling it an example of unmatched honor. Sir, they say you've earned their respect. Washington didn't smile. He didn't boast that. He simply replied, respect is earned by what you do when the world is watching. Honor is earned by what you do when no one is. Asterisk, asterisk, weeks dragged on. The cold cut deeper. The nights grew longer, and yet the army endured. Because every time fear threatened to break them, every time a man felt he couldn't go on, someone would whisper, remember the dog. Remember why we follow him. Remember who Washington is. The story became more than a memory. It became a weapon against despair. It became the heartbeat of Valley Forge. Asterisk, asterisk, and when supplies finally arrived, when fresh troops marched, and something miraculous happened. The Americans at Valley Forge didn't look like men who had survived a winter. They looked like men who had been reborn by it, their eyes clearer, their resolve sharper. Their unity unbreakable. And historians later said, the Continental Army did not survive Valley Forge because of food, fortifications, or reinforcements. They survived because Washington gave them something stronger. He gave them belief. Asterisk, asterisk, and here's the truth. The part history whispers but barely shouts. The revolution was not won on battlefields alone. It was won in the cold, in the dark, in the quiet moments when men chose hope over fear. And that hope, that courage, that will, came from a single act of character, a single moment of compassion, a single decision to return a small, shivering dog. That is the power of integrity. That is the power of leadership. That is the power of George Washington. But what no one expected was how far this single act would echo. Because while the soldiers murmured the story in the cold, and while British officers quietly admired Washington's gesture from the other side of the war, something much bigger was happening, silently, invisibly, beneath the surface. Power was shifting. Not on maps. Not in troop numbers. Not in cannons or muskets. Power was shifting in hearts, and that is something no enemy can calculate. Asterisk, asterisk, weeks after the dog was returned, a man named Baron von Steuben arrived at Valley Forge, a Prussian soldier, a strategist, a man who had seen the brutality of European wars. When he looked at the American camp, he expected to see chaos, broken spirits, a force barely clinging to life. Instead, he saw something else. He saw soldiers who were starving, but refusing to quit. He saw men freezing, but still standing in formation. He saw warriors who should have crumbled, but somehow carried unspoken strength. He asked one officer, what holds these men together? And the officer replied, it isn't food. It isn't supplies. It's Washington. Von Steuben was stunned. Why do they trust him so deeply? The officer took a breath. Because even in war, Washington chooses what is right. Even when he has nothing, he gives everything. You heard about the dog, didn't you? Von Steuben nodded slowly, and the officer whispered, that wasn't a gesture, that was a message. Asterisk, asterisk, months later, when von Steuben began drilling the troops, reshaping them into a real fighting force, he found something astonishing. The men obeyed, not because he barked orders, not because he demanded perfection. They obeyed because they believed they deserved to become something more, something worthy of the general who led them. Imagine this transformation. Soldiers who once stumbled from hunger now marched with precision. Men who once shivered uncontrollably now trained at dawn in the snow. Voices once hoarse with despair now shouted commands with pride. The camp that had once looked like a graveyard now echoed with the sounds of discipline, unity, purpose. Washington didn't just rebuild an army, he reawakened a nation, and it all began with the smallest, simplest, most unexpected spark: compassion. Because compassion creates loyalty, loyalty creates belief, belief creates unbreakable strength. Asterisk, asterisk. One night, deep into the Valley Forge, suffering, Washington wrote in his private journal. His candle flickered in the icy wind that slipped through the canvas of his tent. His fingers were numb. Ink froze in the bottle. But he wrote anyway. He wrote about the hardship. He wrote about the men. He wrote about the burden he carried every moment, every breath. And then he wrote something historians rarely emphasize, a quiet confession. If the soldiers lose faith in me, we lose everything. He didn't worry about numbers. He didn't worry about weapons. He worried about hearts, because he knew a truth leaders rarely understand. You don't command respect, you earn it. And once you earn it, an army will walk through hell for you. And they did. Asterisk, asterisk. As winter slowly began to loosen its grip, something incredible happened. British scouts reported that the American troops, once on the edge of collapse, were now marching with renewed strength. They were drilling like professionals. They were preparing for a season of battle with fire in their eyes. One British officer wrote in disbelief, "It appears that General Washington has forged an army from suffering. What kind of man can inspire such loyalty?" The answer was whispered through both camps: a man who returned a dog. Asterisk, asterisk. And here is the hidden truth, the part history keeps tucked in dusty archives, mentioned only in footnotes. Some British officers believed that Washington's act was so honorable, so unexpected, so deeply rooted in character, that it proved something terrifying. The Americans were not rebels. They were a nation forming itself under a leader unlike any other. Washington didn't just win battles. He won respect. He won loyalty. He won belief. And belief is the strongest weapon in war. The dog incident wasn't a side story. It was the spark before the firestorm. It showed the world that Washington wasn't fighting for power. He was fighting for principle. And that is why, when America was finally born, people didn't just follow him. They trusted him with the destiny of a continent, because a man who shows kindness in the darkest winter will lead with integrity in the brightest victory. But the true ending of this story wasn't written at Valley Forge. Because what happened next proved that Washington's gesture with the dog was not just an isolated moment. It was a preview of the man he would become, and the nation he would inspire. As the brutal winter began to thaw, a strange stillness settled over the camp. Not fear, not despair. Something else. Purpose. Men who once dragged their feet through the snow now marched with rhythm. Men who once whispered doubts now shouted commands. Men who once felt forgotten by the world now believed. They were part of something eternal. The transformation was so dramatic that when foreign officers visited the camp later, they wrote, "These soldiers have suffered more than any men we have ever seen, and yet they stand taller than any army we have ever known." Because suffering didn't break them. It forged them, and the fire that forged them was Washington. Asterisk, asterisk. Months later, when spring finally pushed winter away, the Continental Army emerged from Valley Forge like a force reborn. Their uniforms were still ragged, their supplies were still limited, but their spirit, their will, their belief was uncheckable. On the morning they marched out of Valley Forge, drums echoed across the hills, not the drums of celebration. Not the drums of victory. The drums of survival. Washington rode at the front, his horse's breath steaming in the cold air. Soldiers watched him as he passed, not with fear, not with duty, but with devotion, because they knew the truth. They didn't survive by chance. They survived because of him. Because in the moment when despair was most deadly, he chose compassion. He chose humanity. He chose the act of returning another man's dog instead of exploiting it. That choice had become a seed, small, silent but powerful. And from that seed, hope grew, and from hope, victory became possible. Asterisk, asterisk. But the true ending of this story comes years later, when the war is finally over, when the British surrender at Yorktown, when the last musket falls, silent, when the people cheer Washington as the savior of a nation. During the celebration, a historian approaches one of Washington's surviving soldiers, an old man by now, with frostbitten fingers and eyes that had seen too much. He asks him, what turned the tide of the revolution? Was it the French Navy? Was it von Steuben's training? Was it a brilliant battle strategy? The old soldier smiles. No, he says. It was a dog. The historian laughs, thinking it's a joke, but the soldier continues. You don't understand. That winter at Valley Forge, we were dying. Our bodies were frozen, but our spirits were worse. We had nothing left to fight for. No food. No warmth. No hope. Then the general returned that small British dog. In the middle of war. He chose honor. And that reminded us of something we had forgotten. If our leader still held on to his humanity, then we had no right to lose ours. He paused, his eyes turning distant, remembering the horrible nights of Valley Forge. That didn't save General. It saved an army. Asterisk, asterisk. History often tells this story as a footnote, a little moment, something cute. Something curious. But the men who lived through Valley Forge, they knew the truth. That small act of compassion carried more power than any artillery piece, because it proved something about Washington. He wasn't fighting to win a crown. He wasn't fighting to rule. He wasn't fighting for glory. He was fighting for dignity, for principle, for a world where honor mattered, even in war. And that is why, when the war ended and the people begged Washington to become king, he refused. He walked away from power. He returned to his farm. He showed the world that a man could lead without greed, command without cruelty, and win without losing himself. The dog incident was the earliest sign of who he truly was, a man who believed that character is stronger than cannons, a man who proved that kindness can survive even in the coldest winter. A man who didn't just lead an army. He shaped a nation. And centuries later, long after the musket smoke faded and the soldiers returned to dust, the story of the little dog at Valley Forge remains, not as a tale about war, but as a reminder. Greatness isn't measured by victory. It's measured by the choices you make when no one expects you to choose good, and George Washington chose good. Even in the darkest hour of the harshest winter of America's fight for freedom, that is why he became a legend, not because he won a war, but because he never lost his humanity.